These 5 points are the way I've been able to maintain accuracy in my freehand pen drawing, regardless of how large or small I draw and what the subject is. My first point is that with my starting point, and I have videos on how I choose that, but with my starting point, I particularly try and focus on shape and proportion. And by proportion, we simply mean the relationship, the ratio between, say, the width and the height. And if it's a box-shaped shape, all the better, because that's a simpler shape to try and duplicate. It doesn't matter whether we draw it larger or smaller, but we need to get the proportions of the shape the same. So with this column shaft here, once I've got the height, now I work out the width that needs to be in the same proportions. I don't want my shape to look thinner or taller. And I do this with every shape I draw. Generally, of course, I talk about seeing the three-dimensional form of an object, but there are times where observing shape and proportions is actually helpful for accuracy. So the second way I observe to ensure accuracy in my drawing is this, and can I say that I've left what I think is the most important point till last in true YouTube video tradition. But the second point is to use dots to help placement of angles. Now, we don't have to have architecture with a strong perspective angle to have angles in our scene, but we certainly have them there. And so I look at this angle coming from this point, and I think, what is that angle? It's like that. But now I need to check it, because observations of angles is not particularly easy. And so I'm measuring from this point to there, I check it, and that's pretty good. Actually, oh, hang on. Maybe it's not. Let's have another look. No, it could be too high. So I think it's there. Now what I do is, I don't know where this line is going to end, so I get a bit of muscle memory. And I just do a few more dots to give me a sense of where that is. And now, of course, I check my observation. Okay, I can do the same thing at the base if I want. So let's go from here for this angle. So firstly, where do I think it's going to be? That one seems happier. So firstly, I focus on proportion of shape, height versus width. I use dots to help me position my angles, and that lets me check my observation. Thirdly, I use negative space. Negative space is not the space of an object, but it's the space between the objects. So because we have these columns and this pilaster, negative space is this shape here. Or this shape here. Or this shape between the two columns. And when I draw columns, I particularly use the width of the negative space to help me position the columns. And I refer it back to the shape, so I see this as a shape. Again, I use a dot to locate where I think that shape's going to be. And I need to make sure I make my columns thinner as they move further away. Now I have this shape here. And now this shape is just a bit wider than that one. And this gap here, this shape, is much thinner. And then we have the final one down here. So I'm looking at this in relation to the gaps that I've already drawn. It's wider than this gap. And there's no problem with these dots here because they're going to be hidden by the trees. Dots are very easy things to hide later on in our drawing. And now, my fourth point is to use what I call alignment points when we draw. That's to line up, to align things that we haven't drawn yet with things we have drawn. So for instance, this corner here, align it with the thickness of the column. And what I see is it's actually not in the middle, it's a bit more towards the right-hand side. And this line aligns just overhanging the column. And we can see, in fact, that as the columns move down, if this corner aligns increasingly to the right. And it's the same with the alignment for the bases. And we can also use alignment to check what we've done. So for instance, I can use this point and I can come across horizontally from it and see that it's about 1/3 of the way down. And that's approximately right. It's always helpful to check our observation afterwards. One way we can do that is firstly to check our original proportions. Are we drawing the same size or a bit larger? So my column is that much larger. So I want my width to be wider than the width we have here because I'm drawing, hopefully, in proportion, larger. So from the outside of one column to the outside of the other column is this. And so my portico is wider. And now what I think is the most important point about observation when we draw. And the most important point about observation when we draw is to appreciate that it's actually harder than we think. It's a lot harder than we think. And I'm convinced from all of my experience of drawing and teaching drawing that the biggest problem when I see drawings is not that the person who drew them has lacked, if you like, line skills or technical skills, even if they could perhaps be improved upon, but the fundamental problem is that they've started to draw, they've put the pen on the paper before they've seen what they need to see to be able to accurately draw it. Time and time again when I critique drawings with students, the fundamental issue is they haven't seen what they've needed to see in the way they need to see it. I think it helps to understand why this happens, and it's simply that the observation we do when we draw is a different type of observation that we do for everyday life. We obviously observe all the time, continuously. But that can hide from us the fact that for different purposes, we do observe differently at different times. And when we draw, there are quite specialized needs that we need to meet in our observation if we're going to be drawing, and not, instead of drawing from observation, drawing from our imagination, drawing from our memory, or quite frankly, drawing from guesswork. So the most important point about observation when we draw is to remember before we start, it's harder than I think. It's a skill to learn in itself. And I need to spend more time doing it before I even think of picking up the pen. G'day, I'm Stephen Travis. Hope these 5 points have been helpful for you in your observation for drawing. I'll see you next video. Bye.